In this video, we're going to tie a fly called the Goddard Caddis. First thing we're going to do is we're going to start with some UTC 140 denier thread. I'm going to start my thread about a third of the way back from the eye. I want to make sure that I don't go all the way forward. It's just a gauge to tell me not to go any farther forward than this when I am building the body of the fly. It's just so I don't crowd the front and go too far forward. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to take some deer hair. I'm going to take a nice generous little clump. I'm going to trim off the tips. Kind of do the opposite of what you would do on a normal fly. No need to stack it or anything like that. I'm just going to take this clump and I'm going to work it around the entire hook here. Do a nice loose wrap. And then pull tight. And I just work it around the hook to give it nice coverage. It's hard to actually spin the hair around the bend of the hook. So at this point I just take it and engulf the hook and then do some nice tight wraps. Once I've done that, I'm just going to take all that deer hair and I'm going to pull it back out of the way as much as I can. I'm going to do some nice tight compression wraps right in front of it. There we go. Now the next thing to do is to just continue to build that body. And I'm going to do the same thing, except this time, since I'm not on the bend of the hook, I can actually somewhat spin the deer hair. And that just makes things a little faster, a little bit more even coverage. So I just do two loose wraps, then I pull on that deer hair and just let it spin. If some of it gets caught around the bend, you can just kind of pluck it out with your scissors. Then same thing, I'm just going to take that deer hair and just coax it back. I'll take my thread and jump just in front of it again. And I've got room for one more little section of deer hair. Now it depends on the size that you're tying. If you're tying a small one, you probably only do have room for two sections of deer hair. For video reasons, I do tie these flies a little bit bigger. I'm tying, I think, a size 12 here. So I'll have to do a third tie-in of deer hair. I really do want to make sure that I don't go too far forward on the fly, especially with this last section. I really do need to leave that space up there by the eye. So I'll make sure that I push all this deer hair back and leave myself some room. Then again, just jump the thread in front of all the deer hair. Compress it all back and lay down some nice tight wraps. Then I can take my thread and just work it forward a little bit just so that it's out of the way from the deer hair. And I can just whip finish at this point. I am going to switch threads for the hackle and the antenna. I'll switch to a UTC 170 denier, which is a little thinner. The only reason we use the thicker thread for the body is because we're working with that deer hair, and the thicker thread really does help to manage all that. But the thinner thread, I like a nice thin head, nice and clean at the front, so that's why I switched to the thinner thread. And if you have a second bobbin, it's always nice to have a second one already rigged up. Now the next thing we're going to do is we're just going to trim the body. I'm going to do so just by rounding the front section of the deer hair, kind of in a tube form. Then at the back, we're going to kind of trim a wedged shape in the deer hair. If you have some of it kind of caught around the bend, you can just pluck it all around. And what we're trying to imitate is kind of the tent wing of design of a caddis. That wedge shape kind of helps give it that look, that profile. I like to use a long bladed scissor for this. I use a hair scissor. Really helps trim it all in one nice clean cut. You want to make sure that you trim really good around the bend of the hook as well. You don't want to have too much material around the bend. It will inhibit how the hook sets in the fish's mouth, so you want to make sure you trim nice and good around the bend. It's probably the hardest area to get in there and trim around. You want to make sure you trim out any fibers that are facing forwards near the front as well. You want to get rid of all those forward facing fibers. They will get caught in the hackle at the end. Any lumps in the deer hair you can trim out, kind of fine tune it. And at some point, you kind of have to say it's good enough. A lot of times I just kind of get carried away at trimming. A lot of times it's never good enough for me, but for the most part I would say that's pretty close to good enough. Now we're ready to tie in our UTC 70 thread. Now we can also tie in our antenna. All I'm going to do is just take a quill from the rooster cape feather, a brown rooster cape feather that we're tying our dry fly hackle with, and I'm going to tie it along one side of the shank of the hook. Then I'm going to take that same feather and I'm just going to pull it to the other side here. And then I'm going to just tie it in. And I'll have this nice little loop at the front. I do switch out my hair scissors at this point for my micro tip scissors. They're just a little bit easier to get in there nice and close with. Now we're ready for our hackle. And for the hackle I'm just using a brown whiting rooster cape feather. Tie that in. Whoop, broke my thread somehow. I don't know if it had a nick in it or something. Just get it going here again. Now I just take that rooster cape feather, just tie that in. I like to tie it in so that the barbs are sweeping backwards, so that the feather curves back onto the fly. Every feather does have kind of a concave portion of the feather. You can see with that first wrap, those fibers ever so slightly do lay back. Then I'm going to take that feather and just work it forward onto the head of the fly. I like the head of this fly to be nice and dense, so I try to make those wraps as close to each other as I can. And once I get up there to the eye, I can just capture it. A couple nice tight wraps. Then we can whip finish. And we can trim the antenna. I just trim it right in the middle of those quills. And you can also pull out any of the hackle fibers that got trapped when you whip finished. You can use your scissors, or you can use a pair of hackle pliers to just get in there and break them off. Sometimes that's actually an easy way to get some of those really small fibers out of there. And I kind of push those quills so they have an upward and outward angle. And that's all there is to the Goddard Caddis. Not too hard of a fly to tie. It takes a getting used to. You got to tie a couple of them to kind of figure it out, but very effective little caddis fly, good for fast pocket water and turbulent water because it really floats high with all that deer hair. And you can find all the materials for this fly on our website, intheriffle.com.